My name is Kris Goldsmith. I'm a combat veteran, an anti-fascist investigator, and the founder of Task Force Butler and Veterans Fighting Fascism. I've spent the last few years exposing hate groups, tracking down the violent extremists who threaten our communities, and helping journalists, activists, and law enforcement understand how to fight back. This podcast is another weapon in that fight. You hear a lot these days about defending democracy, but the truth is, defense isn't enough. When you're on defense, you're waiting for the next attack. You're reacting, you're scrambling to catch up. The fascist movement in this country counts on that. They want us stuck in a cycle of reaction, outraged, exhausted, and always a step behind. This show is called On Offense because it's time we start taking the threats we face seriously. No more wasting time mourning rules and norms that were destroyed long ago and no longer matter. We live in a different world now. What the United States and the world has been experiencing over the last decade or so with the rise, normalization, and broad acceptance of authoritarianism is a crisis. We know this. So let's stop ringing the alarm bells and let's move into action. Going on offense means imposing costs on the opposition. It means forcing them to respond, to allocate, expend, and even waste resources. It means exhausting the opposition, forcing them to pick and choose what they want or need to defend. It means taking the initiative and forcing them to worry about what we will do next. In every episode, we'll dig into the roots of what we're facing, because you can't out-organize a threat you don't understand. And we'll talk about what we can do, because awareness without action is surrender. My guest today knows exactly how dangerous it is when we lose control of that story and how powerful it is when we reclaim it. Tad Stoermer is a historian, teacher, and creator whose work dismantles the mythologies that pass for American history. He's the author of the forthcoming A Resistance History of the United States, a book that tells the truth about this country's past, not just to inspire, but to instruct. He serves as a visiting scholar at the University of Southern Denmark and lectures at Johns Hopkins University. Previously, he taught public history at Harvard, worked as a historian at Colonial Williamsburg, and advised on history content at C-SPAN. Tad is one of the most widely followed public historians in the world. He's a veteran of the U.S. Army, a father, and a fierce advocate for using real history as a weapon against authoritarianism. He's spent years studying the authoritarian tendencies that shape this country from the start. How religion has been used to justify control, how nationalism has been weaponized to crush dissent, and how the far right has always relied on myths about American liberty to mask their true intentions. The authoritarianism that we're facing today isn't new. The tactics, the lies, the religion is law, the militia movements, they go back to before this country was born. Tad helps us understand how the founders understood fascism before the word even existed, and why reclaiming the truth about American liberty is key to defeating the far-right lies tearing this country apart. Here's our conversation. Tad, thank you so much for joining us. You are someone that I have tremendous respect for. You are, I think, my absolute favorite TikToker, someone who I have learned a ton from, and someone that I really wanted to prioritize getting on the show very early on, because the things that you have taught me are things that I want to make sure that my audience hears. So welcome. Thank you for coming on.
Well, I appreciate that, Kris. You have a tremendous voice, and it's an important one, and it's one that needs to be heard. So I'm really glad that you're taking this opportunity to go ahead and sharpen it in this way with the new podcast. I think that we're all trying to meet this moment, and doing whatever we can in the roles that we have is, I think, the most and the least that can be asked of us. So I appreciate that. I think that we all have other things that we would rather be doing, but we are called upon, in a sense, in this moment to, again, do everything that we can.
So one of the things that I think that I like most about your content is it challenges me. I am not a history buff, but I am someone who grew up watching the History Channel. I went to Columbia University, where buildings are named after Hamilton. I didn't realize that the way that I deified the founding fathers was perhaps unhealthy. And I think that your way of approaching the founding fathers in calling them enslavers like clearly making that part of their identity. Their fallibility is important for us to recognize. That is something that I don't think that I was conscious of. And that's something that I've been trying to consciously change in the way that I consume media. So this is a long way of asking, why do you think that Ken Burns is an asshole?
Oh boy. And that's something I hold deep in my heart as a conviction. I think Ken Burns is an asshole because he continues to sell people on a story. We're in a fight over narrative. We're in a fight over story. And he keeps selling people on a fiction. This is not, though, a zero-sum game. It's not about telling people that I want to tear down your founding fathers and replace it with, I don't know, some other set of heroes. What we're facing, particularly with Ken Burns, and what we are going to be in the middle of for the next couple of weeks as he rolls out this juggernaut of mythology, is presenting a distorted view of the past to Americans that is comfortable, that is reassuring, but that in the end is a fairy tale that you cannot rely on. I grew up and went to graduate school and was trained in exactly that mythology, because almost most people are. And this idea that the yes but school of the founders. I had a professor in graduate school who when I was teaching a course on Thomas Jefferson, talked about his complexities and said, well, we need to get to a conversation that is beyond the complexity. So when you begin, go ahead and admit that, yes, he was a debt-ridden enslaver, but let's move on to his contributions. Let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater. To actually assume that there is an inherent balance there at the very beginning for somebody who brutalized 400 people every day. And so when you think about that as lived experience, when you think about the fact that these are people that, had they been white, would be considered in an entirely different perspective when it comes to our understanding of what the words were that these folks deployed, and therefore what kind of weight we place on them. So what Ken does is try to rehabilitate that perspective. And there's a functional element here, that the reason why we need to be able to objectively question them. I'm not saying tear them down and throw them away. I'm saying that deal with them in real terms, on objective terms. If you want to accept them warts and all and still infuse their language with something that you want to value, then you do you. But do it understanding not just their complexity, not just that they were deeply torn. No, maybe that they were deep hypocrites, that they didn't mean what it is that they said that they meant, rather than trying to rehabilitate that into something that it wasn't. Because what I really discovered in working and studying more deeply the revolution and the founding, and more to the point, how that informs our political culture today, is that it imbues those words, those institutions, those actions of the founding with so much unquestioned and unquestionable meaning that they cannot be changed, they cannot be questioned. So whenever we talk about, when we look around us, so when we talk about executive overreach, when we talk about the abuse of authority of this particular regime, when you talk about the kind of change that people think that they need to see around them, you run into this wall of what cannot be changed, which is the Constitution, our constitutional framework. It's just a fight over whose version of the founders gets to win. And it works out this way, and whether it's originalism or however you want to call it, and this is what I mean by that we're in a narrative fight. When we are talking about any kind of meaningful change in the United States, what it ends up being is whether you can craft a story that is able to adapt that language that's, 240 years old, or if you're talking about the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, 100 and some years old, 140 years old, that you have to go ahead and make sure that you are crafting your narrative to fit those words in one way or another, because an actual clear change to the Constitution, such as a constitutional amendment, is impossible. And because you can't do that, any change you want, whether it is identifying a woman's right to choose, how do you do that? What does the culture determine that you must do? You have to come up with a story that is able to adapt the language of the Fifth Amendment, the language of the 14th Amendment, this language that is centuries old, to your vision of modern rights. That's unfair. That's inherently unfair. No other country works like that. That's a dumb way to look at the way rights and our concept of rights evolve. However, because we can't in fact change that, you have to create a story that is within a jurisprudential context to go ahead and adapt that language to whatever modern concept, a legitimate concept of rights that you have. So 1972, Roe versus Wade, the counsel for Roe was able to go ahead and create that narrative and sell it to the Supreme Court, who was able to go ahead and fashion their own opinion, their own narrative about how that concept of right kind of fit within the penumbra of the amendments to the Constitution to identify a right to privacy. Not that the right to privacy should be there. The right to privacy absolutely has a place in the Constitution of the United States, but no, because we can't change it. You have to massage it through this storytelling to have language that was never written to accommodate it. This is a dumb way to engage in any kind of defense of rights, which is why it's tenuous. The only thing holding that together were people deciding that that was the story they were going to continue to agree on. Nothing else, nothing structural, no explicit language that I actually identified that legitimate right. No, we had to agree that that story was going to be the one that we abided by until we didn't. Until Dobbs, when a court said, no, I understand that it's a different story. So we're going to adapt the other story, the story in which that language doesn't apply, in which we don't see it in the language of the middle of the 1860s. They didn't conceive of abortion. They couldn't have thought of abortion rights. So therefore, Roe was determining in terms of what that language meant cannot be what that language meant. This is a dumb way to think about rights in a country that we should be expanding equality and its protections for everybody. But to do that is forever within the context of these guys who have been dead for 240 years, is a dumb way to do it. But the issue that we run into, because our political culture is so dependent on our worship of these guys, that we can't even begin to question that, to change it in any meaningful way. And when I thought about that, I wanted to understand what drove it. I wanted to understand what the dynamics were. I wanted to understand how it actually operated, not just in our present, but how we got here with that. And that's why, and to see how, once you start seeing it, you see it everywhere, but you also see how artificial it is, how absolutely artificial it is. And that if you start thinking more clearly in objective ways, just by making sure that you're not freighting the American Revolution and the founding with anything that is distorting and mythological, that you can in fact get to a different concept of what they were trying to accomplish, one that is rich, one that is even inspirational. You can identify other kinds of heroes, other kinds of traditions you might want to follow to inform the way we approach rights today. But what Ken does is that he wants to serve up aggressively this other comfortable mythology. And so now with the American Revolution, he has a very particular, he thinks that the solution to our problems today, to get all Americans to come together under the same umbrella, to realize that we all share more than we differ, is that the American Revolution is in fact a celebration of the diversity of America. And so therefore, when you understand that diversity is a founding principle, that diversity was in our founding institutions, in particular, he's big on the Continental Army as reflecting that diversity, then all of the people who are at odds today can, if they accept that they were all there at the beginning and all were a part of this grasp towards a kind of democratic set of principles, then it informs who we are as Americans today in this Benetton ad. And so it doesn't quite, but that story is aggressively manufactured, and you have to run roughshod through a lot of really good scholarship and really authentic history to actually get there and to hold on to that. And to have the kind of media assets that he has behind this story just continues to go ahead and reinforce the misperception that the founders are still running the show, that we still somehow can live neatly and coherently within the context of 1776 and 1787, which was never going to be able to adapt to the country we've become. And so what it does is it erases our ability to appreciate every single thing that Americans have in fact fought for and accomplished since. That American history begins and ends in terms of this story by 1787.
If the Constitution and the founders if they aren't sacred, if this is more myth than history, doesn't this kind of give, like, if we accept that as fact, if this is what we believe, doesn't that give Donald Trump and today's nationalists an opportunity to further rewrite history and to use our denial of American history, of their version, as reasons to call us heretics and to discredit us and to impose their will and more power against us? But it makes me nervous to let go of these myths. I mean, I have Columbia tattooed on my arm, right? And I think about the way that Columbia has been depicted by this administration and the way that we're criticizing the photo of Columbia marching west, and basically stomping out indigenous people. Like, where do we go from here? Are they going to use our attempt to bring reality into this history against us? Are we putting ourselves at risk when we do this?
Yeah, it's destabilizing because it's about these foundation elements of American identity, of who we think we are. However, I think that there is a different way to look at this. And they're already doing that. And they're doing that in a way that is going unchallenged because, frankly, people like Ken Burns, the liberal nationalists, the Aaron Sorkins of the world, because nationalists all have the same goal of just reinforcing the primacy of those people and of that period in all of our history, that it all just reinforces that that's where we should look for all of the authority that we draw on. Instead of thinking that there is an alternative America out there. There is the America that we became. There is the democracy that people fought and died to go ahead and create. But that came with a massive body count. And when we talk about resistance history, this is about looking at all of the people who pushed back against authority and the gains that they made to achieve all of the things that we think of when we think about what's great to be an American, about our fights for liberty, about our fights for equality, to expand freedom and liberty to others, and those guarantees under the Constitution. That came, though, by opposing all of those things. And that is looking at, instead of saying to somebody like Donald Trump, is that, wait a second, your version of America is an old and dead version of America. That's a version of America that hasn't existed since it was buried in 1866. That's what the Civil War is about. That's what the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments did. It created the multiracial democracy that we were able to become. And by continuing to abide by their terms, by the rules of their game, we ignore all of those things that in fact departed from that first republic that was created by these people who never meant a word of what it is that they said. And instead of saying, you know what, that's okay, you can let that go. And instead, we can, in fact, look at the sacrifice of the Civil War, what they were, in fact, able to accomplish, and the dramatic structural change they made to the Constitution, and give that meaning. And the fact that those amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, and all that structural change during the Civil War was able to provide the building block of the expansion of rights and liberties through the 20th century. To excluded groups, to women, to the LGBTQ community, that all relies on that basis, not on anything that James Madison said. And I think that without pushback and a meaningful direct pushback on that founders worship that represents so much of what Trump relies on for his source of increased authority, that they are in fact the heirs of those folks. I think that to make sure that it's not a confused and distorted fight is to go ahead and be direct and clear. Let them have those guys. We've got Frederick Douglass. We've got Thaddeus Stevens. We've got Rosa Parks. We've got these other incredible heroes that actually built on that to create what we value as being a multiracial democracy, something that the founders wouldn't have tolerated in a second. And yet somebody like Ken Burns continues to try to turn those guys into these founders of these at least originators of America's modern democracy, and therefore making their words still matter when it is destabilizing at first when you think that I've got to let go of the kind of mythology that's there. But when you start putting in the other voices and you're able to see a more clear picture, it's like a puzzle that you only have a third of the pieces for, but you're told that the entire puzzle looks like just what the pictures are that you can gain from those third of the pieces. No, you start putting the rest of the puzzle in and you see something much different, much more reliable, much more authentic, that then can actually inform your behavior, because frankly, it makes sense.
So on the topic of our behavior, I think another myth that you've shattered for me is kind of the myth of peaceful protest being used to achieve progress throughout the United States and globally. I think when I was in high school, or elementary school, when I learned about Harriet Tubman for the first time, I wasn't learning about Harriet Tubman leading raids. I wasn't hearing, the Underground Railroad to me as a child, when it was taught to me, was sneaking away in the night. And there was no violence in that story. The stories of Martin Luther King, I think, have been sanitized, and I've gotten the opportunity to learn more about this as I've been older, just through today's social media. I think is more truthful than the version of Martin Luther King and the protests that he and Malcolm X led. But can you tell us why things like these No Kings protests and the 3.5% movement are perhaps a little falling short?
Yeah, it's a falling short. I guess is a nice way to put it. Let's just say that it's insufficient to achieve the goals that I think a lot of people are reaching for today. They're nice in what they do in terms of creating a level of visibility and generating a sense of solidarity, but they are limited pretty much to that. What in looking at the way that resistance has operated and evolved over U.S. history, what we see is the way that people have identified change that was necessary and then pursued that change through permissible channels, through courts, through legislation, through regular politics, through peaceful protest, to the point where that was no longer sufficient. And then seeing what they did then. There has been we can overuse the term mythology, but it's true that there is a mythology in American political culture that is the way to change within the American spirit. That because our institutions are fundamentally good, because they fundamentally bend towards justice, then working through those institutions is the only real sanctioned way to achieve change. You can be a noble loser, you can be a happy warrior, you can go through the courts, and if you lose, then you should just be satisfied that you deserve to win, and maybe your children can get further or your grandchildren can get further. That is kind of part of the story that we tell ourselves. But that's not what the history says. The history is full of people who saw that and saw the change that needed to be made, because authority was continuing to hurt people, continuing to oppress people, continuing to limit them, that they had to operate outside of what was permitted. And that ends up being a kind of negotiation of the possible in terms of what people were willing to accept that they could do. And violence is a part of that. And people can be naive and want to dismiss that. But I think that people tend to be, and when you tend to look at No Kings and you look at other kinds of rally movements today, what you see is unwillingness to risk. And that is the underlying key to all resistance movements, in not just in U.S. history, but anywhere. That if you, at a certain point when the permitted channels have reached their points of exhaustion in terms of enabling the kind of change that you want to see, then by stepping outside what's permitted, by stepping outside what the law says, by stepping outside what the culture says, by sometimes stepping outside of what your previous concept of morality said, that involves risk. That risk can be immediate. It can be about, you look at candidates for Congress now that are stepping in front of ICE. I mean, other people who are stepping in front of ICE that are doing this stuff. You see the coverage on CNN where people are, and videos that are going around about, and this is kind of where the rubber meets the road with this kind of stuff, pushing back against ICE as they are violating other people's rights, as they are being brutal, and then having millimeters pulled on them and pointed at their heads and saying, "I'm going to shoot you." That is the point at which that level of kind of permitted change has been exhausted. But that is the point of risk, that you've got to be willing to go ahead and what are you willing to lose in order to see the change that you want to see? And that ends up being a balancing act. If you're not really willing to risk much, then the change you want to see probably isn't that high. And that's one of the problems that we see in the protest movements is mostly the absence of a clear articulation of what the problem is.
Yeah. So you're over in Europe right now. When we first connected on TikTok, you had gone silent for a little bit and reached out and said you were apologizing because you were moving your family over there. You had said that they had started facing some consequences for the way that you speak out.
Yeah.
We've also seen a lot of folks that have been kind of like the MSNBC standards of Timothy Snyder, who's on my anti-fascist book club, is one of the first on tyranny, is one of the first books I encourage people to read. One of my other favorite TikTok creators, Professor Mira, has gone back to Germany.
Yeah.
What are you gone for good? How should Americans be thinking about this moment? What are you looking at? What does this moment remind you of in history? If all the historians and the anti-fascist historians are leaving the U.S., what should the rest of us be thinking?
Well, to me, it's all about what really is our highest and best use and how do we get into a position to be able to serve that purpose. I did what I needed to do to keep my family safe. But in the end, the idea that even giving up the kind of comfort that one had at home for putting everybody someplace else, it's going to be a while before I see an Orioles game and before I see the Chesapeake Bay again. But the bigger point is that whether you're Tim Snyder or whether you're Jason Stanley or any of these folks who are looking at what is the greatest value we can be in this moment and making sure that you can put yourself in a position where all of the other kinds of challenges are at least manageable so you can focus on doing this. That's the way I approached it. And I think that's the way a lot of my colleagues are doing this. That I think that my highest and best way to contribute to this is to think and write and encourage and engage and educate and act. And I can do that best from here. My grandmother used to say that it's better to go ahead and evaluate a burning building when you're outside of it. And if that's your job, then that's what you got to do, whether it's easy or whether it's hard. And I think that that's the choice that I made. It's much easier for me to do this work from over here and still be connected and still be engaged. And I wouldn't have been able to finish writing the book back home and to be able to think about this in such clear ways and then think about how it continues and how it applies. And to me, that's the most clear thing. And when we were talking about violence before, is that it's not about embracing particular tactics that are destructive. It's about understanding and accepting that change requires nothing being taken off the table, that you have to be willing to do whatever it takes and whatever form that takes. And then whatever morality you can muster that can reinforce your approach to that, well, do that. We can come together to do that. But we have to understand and be able to diagnose and be able to call out what is going on in as clear a way as possible. And so that's why I think in this kind of conversation, I know that you encounter it online a lot too, when people are asking what they can do, but they are admitting to their own limitations. They're identifying their own limitations. Well, I am only X. I am only Y. And I think that none of that's relevant. I think everybody needs to identify as much as they can do. And because it is not what you think is a kind of broad spectrum that somebody else is achieving because they're getting more attention. Resistance movements are made up of a whole bunch of cogs in the machine. I mean, that's what makes the Underground Railroad so cool. And when I look at it and when I'm looking at it closely, as this sophisticated, clandestine underground network that moved 50,000 people from slavery to freedom is extraordinary. But that required everybody deciding to do their part. And when I studied that deeply and then I pulled out and I put it into other resistance contexts, and the best other resistance context is World War II. So I was doing a lot of work in that because we were able to see in a very brief period of time, under the most extreme conditions, how resistance movements evolve, how they organize under the most extreme kind of abusive authority and under the most extreme kind of duress. And so we were able to see in just a couple of years, all of the elements, how they all work, where they all fail, how they succeed, and then to be able to see how resistance dynamics can in fact play across different contexts. And then so I take that back to the context of the United States and look at something like the Underground Railroad and then apply that to today. And the big lesson with that is that everybody needs to identify what their highest and best use is. If they are somebody who is is because their time, because their passion, because their capacity is about, they're going to go ahead and copy and repost and comment and boost the people who are the strongest voices on this stuff, and they're going to go ahead and counter and dispute and diminish the folks who are part of the problem. Then that is a great way to do it. If your thing is about, you're going to help people raise money, if your thing is about, you're going to organize people on your block, then do that. But the thing that we all have to ask ourselves is, what really, as a resistance fighter, what kind of resistance fighter am I? I don't have to be the one that storms the ramparts, because not everybody can do that. But because it takes a lot of people, and this is one of the things that I absolutely learned from doing this history, it takes so many people to be able to enable that person who breaches the ramparts, who is that person who's giving the speech, who is that person that seems to be kind of inspirational. But that person requires a whole network, a whole army of folks performing all kinds of different roles behind them. And I think that to me is the challenge that people kind of need to face today, is not to hold themselves back by what they think that they cannot do. And instead of thinking, what is the most that they can do in being the kind of resistance fighter that they can be? And that's kind of what I hope that they were able to find in my book. Yep. You know, it can be dense in parts, and there's a lot of moving parts. But to me, I want them to be able to see and identify with who they speaks to them. Are they, a thinker or a writer like Thoreau? Are they an actor like Nancy Dixon or Harriet Tubman? Are they somebody who is about persevering in individual acts like Ona Judge? Are they standing up for the truth like any of the people who were executed during the Salem witch trials? Are they standing up for the truth, come what may? I mean, that's the kind of thing that people I want to identify with.
So this is something that I struggle with. I am someone who people constantly tell me like how brave I am for speaking out and being so loud and, going up on stage at the the June 6th event. But everything that I do is a calculated risk, as you're describing. I recognize the privileges that I have. I am a bald, bearded, tattooed combat vet who has a concealed carry permit. I have a 90-pound pit bull and 8 cameras around my house. Before the first time I ever got swatted, I was sure to make friends with the local police department and let them know, hey, this is what I do for a living. I hunt Nazis. I'm going to get swatted one day. So I am doing all of this. I know how to protect myself. But one thing that I don't do is show up at protests. I don't go to street protests anymore. The last time that I went to a street protest was in 2008, was at the McCain and Obama debate outside Hofstra University in New York. I was a member of Iraq Veterans Against the War, and one of my friends got his head stepped on by a police horse. After that, I'm done. I've got enough shit that I dealt with in Iraq to see that kind of violence happen to one of my friends here stateside. That shook me to my core, and he will never be the same. Like his life is forever changed. I struggle with telling people to go to protests, even just simple street protests. I am not someone who very often tells people, like, I don't really openly support the No Kings protests, even though I don't believe that they're very likely to end up in violence. Am I doing the wrong thing? Am I... you and I are both Army vets. It is, I imagine you feel the same way. It is so hard for me to tell someone to do something that I would not do.
Yeah.
Like, how do you deal with that? What is it seems absolutely clear from your writings, from TikTok, where you talk about, things like sabotage. Being an essential part of resistance, if not in the U.S., through fascist regimes in Europe during World War II. It wasn't just the United States Army that broke the Nazis. It was Germans. It was the Polish. It was people who were being occupied, who were putting their lives at risk and actually causing real damage, putting themselves not just at risk of getting shot, but of getting prosecuted. How do you and I, people with platforms who are living in relative comfort with our calculated risks, knowing that our families are safe with what we're doing, as scary as it might appear to other people who don't know how protected we are, what do we do? How do we do this right? How do we live by our own moral standards that we're trying to project? How do we not be hypocrites when we tell people that they need to go on offense?
You've got to push the privilege. You got to push the privilege as far as it's going to go until the point where you think it might break. The kind of things that we do. It's not like we're not already fighting against the challenges of the algorithm, fighting the challenges of the platform. What is the most that we can do to actually speak to the audiences that we can speak to, and what will give us the most push for that? I think that in terms of being true to that, and the point about hypocrisy is an important one, right? Is that in terms of looking in the mirror and not asking other people to do things that we're not willing to do, and looking at how other people have operated in the past. To me, it's got to be about making sure that even the kind of comfort that you're able to carve out for your family and for the people you care about, that you're therefore able to go ahead and take the privilege that you have, and you're able to go ahead and again, push that to its absolute limits. That speaking things as clearly as they can. I identify the privilege that I have, and the kind of doors that my credentials open, that my background opens, and that I have to go ahead and push through in that in ways that ways that have threatened my career, ways that threaten my standing, whatever that is. But it is to make sure that you are blowing through what you think of those perceived limits on yourself as possible. Like we talked about before, that this is not the easiest thing in the world that we could be doing. And given the fact that this is not something, and I encounter this more every day, this is not something that's limited to the United States in terms of the authoritarian forces. It is manifesting itself in the United States and is taking a particular form in the United States, but it is in no way limited to the United States. And we have to understand that this is a global problem, and it's manifesting itself in all kinds of areas all at the same time. So this is a global fight, and people will find you wherever you are. There in fact is no hiding from this. But it is making sure that the privileges that you have, that you're not hiding behind. That I think that is, to me, every day that I know that I'm here. So I've got to be up at 4:30. I've got to be doing this work. I've got to be doing this writing. I've got to be engaging these audiences. I've been giving not just the privilege of who I am, but the privilege of what I do, and the privilege that my audience and this community gives me in letting me into their devices every day, that I can't sit back and just sort of like decide that I'm going to go ahead and do posts about, I don't know, I'm going to decide I'm going to do it about how much I love Jane Austen because all of these people are out there for that, right? I mean, I'd love to go ahead and talk about how much I like Counting Crows. That's not okay. That is not why I'm in this position. That is not the highest and best use of what I can do. So if that means getting up every single morning and writing the book and thinking about it hard and plowing through to get it done so that it is out next June, and we can talk about it until then, and then we can help explain it. We can help apply it, whether, frankly, between you and me, I don't care whether people buy the book or not. I'd rather go ahead and talk about all of this stuff and make it all accessible based upon what I've learned in that process, so that people can use it. And I think that we end up being hypocrites if we take a step back from being able to maximize every single tool that we've been given. And that's the way I look at it. And if it means that I don't get to take a vacation, then it means I don't get to take a vacation. I mean, that's a luxury. And I think that there are a lot of folks who don't have those kind of luxuries today.
Thank you for that. That is something that I think helps. Now, I guess to ask this as clearly as I can. I think that we are experiencing a period where, and it seems clear from what I've learned from you, that people are going to get hurt. Who is going to get hurt? What role do we play in communicating that to people? Like, how do we responsibly prepare people for that without terrifying them? Because that is one of the balancing acts that I think that folks, whether they're talking heads on MSNBC or they're on TikTok or some other social media platform, like, we seem to be avoidant about talking about that fact. Like, you've said ICE agents are pulling out their 9mm and pointing it at Americans' heads because they're standing up. ICE agents are going to start pulling the triggers. We are watching a massive recruiting campaign where they're getting things like $50,000 bonuses. And as veterans, we know that when you have to give a bonus that large to get somebody in uniform, the standards are going down.
Yeah.
So are we months away from those triggers getting pulled? Are years away from those triggers getting pulled? Who's going to take the bullet? And how do we responsibly prepare Americans to not be terrified by this, but to recognize it as a fact and continue to move forward?
It's by helping them understand that violence is already here, that people are already being hurt. People are already on the losing side of those kind of interactions. The question is about the nature and scope of it. I mean, when does it get to people who are comfortable now? That's the only question. The idea that there's already violence. There are already people who are being grabbed, that are being hurt, that are being on the wrong end of these interactions. Violence is already there. What we're talking about is the point at which it escalates, and are you prepared to push back on that? I think that one of the things that we see, and you know this about violence and the threat of violence, and in the kind of experiences that we've had, the idea that violence that legitimate violence is just on one side is already a highly destabilizing way to think about things. And so what I think about is that when people understand that people are already getting hurt, that there's already violence in this, and that you need to do what you can to be prepared for when that, not if, but when that violence scales, when that violence reaches comfortable people, when that violence reaches a particularly damaging threshold. When somebody pulls the trigger like that, because of this destabilizing dynamic that's already there, it's just a matter of how prepared you're going to be with that. Because right now, because of the way that authority is expanding and the people who are using it, these people are not terribly well trained. These people, I mean, clearly you see that the way that they're acting, they don't know what threat assessment is. They're not there to kind of de-escalate. They're there to go ahead and accomplish these very particular goals in these very brutal ways that are inviting that escalation. Nobody wants to see that violence escalate, but as long as the threat continues to be there on one side, it almost ensures that it's going to happen, which is why there is a major failure on the part of opposition leadership to really have any kind of meaningful pushback against this administration, to sort of point again to, you continue to point to these permitted channels. Gavin Newsom deciding that he's just going to file the next lawsuit to go ahead and have a court do something for him. You have Pritzker going out there and saying, well, not in my state, not in my city, until it is in his state and in his city. Mm-hmm. And then what does he do? He goes to court. People will continue to be destabilized and be unsure. And that level of, to the extent that any violence is controllable, that level of uncontrollable violence is a potential when people think that there is no alternative than what's in front of them and when they're scared. That kind of thing. I think that when you're talking about who is going to get hurt, it's going to be the people it's going to be this increasing spectrum of the people who are already getting hurt. It's just going to be more and more and more of them. This is something that is a ball that just rolls downhill. It has its own inertia. Mm-hmm. And that is the problem what you're talking about is that if you see the kind of authority they are wielding as having that kind of inertia, it doesn't stop. You don't stop it by yelling at it. You don't persuade it to stop. It doesn't stop until you put something in front of it, until you step in front of it, until you roll it back. It is that kind of dynamic that you have to understand is realistic. And what we see is that there are historical parallels for that. It is when that people saw the abusive authority of the federal government being used to enforce the enslaver power, and they decided that, you know what? We can't do this. There's already being violence every single day against the 4 million people in chains. But the problem is, and this is what Thoreau pointed out, the problem is that comfortable people in the middle were having that conversation. Is that, wait a second, when is that authority going to reach me safe and sound in upstate New York or in Western Massachusetts or wherever? And they're having that conversation, not realizing that violence is already there. They're already playing a role in it by not stopping it. They're just enabling it to continue. And so the more pushback that there is, then the more abusive authority has to stop, has to take notice, has to count the cost for themselves, that might in fact slow it down to enable a better, more organized opposition to emerge.
So we have seen institution after institution fold in front of Donald Trump with, frankly, what I think is very little pressure. I think that a lot of institutions, whether it be law firms, these massive, massive law firms, or these universities, prestigious universities that have all of the resources in the world. And we've watched, as you've said, the opposition fold, saying that their hands are just tied. What about this moment do you find to be most scary, terrifying, depressing, as the worst sign? And you know, what do Americans do to convince the opposition party that it needs to act with real resistance and not feign outrage?
The most dangerous thing is the absolute absence of any kind of organized, coherent opposition, any kind of real leadership, because that enables the abuse of authority. That gives Trump and Hegseth and those folks this perception, this mistaken, this actual perception right now, that they can do whatever they want with impunity. And they can expand because there is no identifiable pushback. That is the most dangerous thing. The fact that people are okay with, whether it's Chuck Schumer or whether it is other kinds of sort of ostensible leaders on the Democratic side, that by continuing just to engage in this kind of performative opposition without any kind of meaningful pushback, they don't realize that just enables them to go forward. They have no reason to change. It creates the inertia in their abuse. And so they don't understand the role that they are playing to enable the abuse of authority and to enable its growth and expansion. There's no reason that Donald Trump shouldn't rip down the other parts of the White House. Why? Who's going to stop him? Who isn't? To, in fact, the idea that they have the capacity just to think about whatever it is they want to do that's next. They cannot care about the Constitution. They cannot care about checks and balances. They cannot care about Congress. Why? That's what's dangerous. That is what almost ensures that this will get worse before it gets better. Because what the Democrats have surrounded themselves in this idea that things will get somehow better if they win in 2026 at the midterms. And it is this absence of a recognition about how much damage has already been done, what it would require to rebuild, in fact, what has already been taken up, that it doesn't just get magically restored if they somehow get back the House. And that the amount of damage that can be done even between now and then for people who believe that there is no challenging them, there is no way to, there's no reason for them to stop. That is the biggest problem that we face right now, is the fact that folks who are ostensibly it's two things. First is that there are people in ostensible positions of leadership who don't recognize that they are enabling the problem by their failure to act in any kind of meaningful way against it. And then the people beneath them, by continuing to reinforce their leadership, enable them. So it is this awful cycle of enabling the authority by this performative opposition, rather than recognizing that leadership that pushes back in it in much more concrete ways might in fact have to go ahead and engage in some risk. I mean, what we've seen it in a couple of times where there was a spark. Like we saw it in LA when there was the opposition there before the Marines were deployed. But that kind of physical standing in the way of what ICE was doing, with a clearly defined message about what the abuse was, how to stop it, how to get in front of it. And what we saw was that recalculation. Wait a second, they had to slow down, they had to deploy more ICE agents, they had to deploy the Marines. That alone shows you how it works. That shows you how opposition works in reality on the ground. You make them recalculate, redeploy, engage in commit more resources, spend more money, distract them by driving them crazy. We were able to see that. If there was leadership, that is something that could have escalated at scale. You start doing that in Austin. You start doing that in Portland. You start doing that in Chicago by not necessarily going to the point of provocation, but by actually pushing back on them in ways that make them uncomfortable, make them recalculate, that make them reconsider. The fact that we saw little bits and pieces of it, you see the potential. What needs to happen is that at scale. But that requires people to be organized, to engage in committing resources, but not to perform it. It's not about standing behind a podium. It's not about giving a press conference. It's not about going to court. This is about deploying resources on the ground in front of these folks, but being smart about it and strategic about it, that you have to make them expend their resources, recalculate, and redeploy. It's as simple as that, but we don't see it. I don't see that kind of work happening. What you do see is that work happening to do more no kings, which they can outlast. What they can outlast is 1,000 people standing in front of them when they're trying to go ahead and get at, 15 United States citizens or legal residents who deserve to be here and not be spirited away and disappeared to someplace else. That is hitting it at its point of action. And it's identifying tactically what that means, and then strategically being able to deploy resources to be able to target those points. We're not seeing any of that because people still think that the best rollback is Gavin Newsom or Pritzker or whatever's going on in Capitol.
The goal of this podcast is to tell our listeners how they go on offense. So you've identified the problem that is a lack of leadership. How do we find that leadership to go on offense? And can you tell us how your book coming out in June is going to help teach us some of these lessons?
Well, first and foremost, how do we do this? This is about making sure that the attention economy that we're in is that people are start to divert their attention from the folks who are performing opposition to the folks who are in fact doing it. That's just what people like Newsom are doing. It's just a distraction. He's running for president. Let him run for president. He's not going to do anything that, in fact, directly pushes back on what's going on the ground right now, whether that's in Chicago or that's in DC or Memphis or wherever it is. It's making sure that people are devoting their attention to asking the questions about who, in fact, is doing that kind of organizing on the ground that can bring those resources to bear where it really matters most, where that abuse of authority is really happening. If you know Congress isn't going to do it, as we saw with the shutdown, then give them the irrelevance that they deserve. Focus instead on the people who can do things in a kind of parallel authority that can in fact push back and say, you know what we need to do first and foremost as the single probably most prominent domestic articulation of the abuse is what ICE is doing every day. Let's focus on where they are. Let's get people to where they are. Let's actually make sure that we got legal tools and we've got community help and we've got logistics in order to be able to make sure that we are deploying resources in these places to physically stand in front of them and to be willing to accept those risks about what might happen, but also understand that the value of that from a resistance standpoint is to make them change their minds, is to in fact show people that something can be done. That's what I think, right now that people can do is to stop wasting time and attention and breath on people who are just performing opposition and to start asking the right questions and the most effective questions about who is in fact doing, who are the I don't want to say boots on the ground, but who's doing the grunt work, Kris? Who is really doing that? Who are the NCOs of this movement, right? Yep. Those are the folks who I'm talking about. And forget about the fat guys at the top. This is about the NCOs on the ground who are thinking about how to do this at a I don't want to keep with a metaphor, but it works for us, is that who's doing resistance at a squad level, right? I mean, how does this work? I think that is what the questions are, okay, who is doing that work in my community? Who is doing that work and if you get enough people who are doing that and they start talking to each other, that's how you can build a real opposition movement. That's how you can, in fact, build something that involves leaders whose names we don't know yet. And every single resistance movement is derived from people who come out of the woodwork, not from the people who and as far as my book, I think that it gives all of this a reliable, authentic history that people can look to and point to, that they can then use to inform not just the pattern that they can see that's going on around them, but they can also see how they can fit in that. One of the things that was important to us is to make sure that I was able to identify resistance principles that work regardless of historical context, that you can see at play in a historical moment in our history without having to shoehorn it, right? This is just about restoring voices to the history that deserve to be there, and to be able to read that in an honest way, but to be able to see how that I'm not there to go ahead and give you a new way of looking at the history of the United States. That's not my job, but is to actually see how resistance has worked in the history of the United States, and how that actually works in terms of broader resistance dynamics that you can apply to any context, particularly your own. And to be able to use these principles, see how in fact they have authentically worked for other people, how they might work for you, and in fact how you can apply it. That to me is that you can use the book as a toolkit for understanding that, so you can ask more clear, demanding questions of the people who are not just trying to inform you about what you should do in terms of resistance, but then you can start asking harder questions about what other people are doing and what other people say you might or should be or shouldn't be doing when it comes to resistance. Because you know what it takes, you know what its shortcomings are, you know who, frankly, you know who are the false prophets. And that's been a theme that kind of unexpectedly ran through that. It ends up being my first chapter because I thought it was important for people to be able to identify what resistance isn't, because a lot of people try to take advantage of moments of instability in order to just, grab greater shares of power that they already have. Mm-hmm. But the way that runs through it, particularly in U.S. history and looking at the people who, particularly when you're talking about the anti-slavery resistance to the First Republic, how folks looked at that and looked at the people who were, again, they were performing opposition. They wanted to go ahead and engage in all of these compromises, and they wanted to tell people that, no, you can't engage in violence, that we have to go through these permitted ways, and that we have to go ahead and make sure that we're not risking the stability of the country, that we can't risk losing our positions, because that is the only way that we're going to be able to go ahead and get forward and change things, even if it's gradual and incremental. To be able to get into the positions of people who heard the exact same messages about the exact same kind of abuse of authority and be able to identify it for what it was, as these real limits, as these real shortcomings, and then ask their own questions about what it is that they should do, what it is that it takes. Everything that we've talked about, almost every question that you raised, and I think this is a reflection of how authentic your approach is, Kris, that this is stuff that people in exactly these kind of situations have dealt with. They are morally problematic. They are complicated. They involve asking questions about who we are as individuals, about what we believe, the kind of values that we hold, in ways that make us question what we really mean by them and how committed we are to them, in ways that most generations don't have to ask. This idea that, a generation being called in the moment of democracy's greatest peril, this is that moment. And to be able to ask and answer those questions. I think about, the oaths that we took to the Constitution. And that's not just to a Constitution that was passed. That's not just to the Constitution that was written by James Madison. I think about that now as an oath that I never gave up, but it's to the Constitution that can be as well. This is to that living Constitution, to what it can be for all Americans. But it is in making sure that we can ask those vital questions of ourselves and answer them, and knowing that other people did that too, that it was hard for them too, that it was confusing for them too, that it was fluid for them too, and then to see how they dealt with it. What was the point at which they, as the question that you asked, what was the point that they reached that the question of who's going to get hurt and when and what do I do about that they had to engage with in real time? People have been there, and it's never easy. But to know that people did that and they asked those questions and dealt with those issues in ways that are recognizable, in ways that people don't need, a PhD, 18 years in graduate school, having read 18 million books. No, this is about being a human, and this is about being an American and understanding what our values are and should be, and questioning those in those moments because other people did, and being able to rely on that as a history that people can draw on the primary sources and read for themselves, not just take my word for it. I hope I don't ask people to do that for anything, but that people can go ahead and take that on their own terms to figure out what resistance means to them. But that's as much about trying to understand what it is that they are for, what it is that they represent. Because to me, resistance has been a fairly progressive, in the best sense, movement throughout American history. It's how we have gotten, and gotten our liberties and expanded them across 200 years. And I think that's a pretty cool tradition to be a part of.
Well, Tad, thank you so much for taking all this time today. Again, I'm so glad to get you on this podcast early. I hope to have you back, not just again soon, but I hope to have you back a bunch, because there's so much more that I can learn from you, so much more that this audience can learn from you. Last thing, real short, where can people find you on the various platforms, and where can they buy your book?
Well, they can buy my book anywhere. They can buy it at penguinrandomhouse.com, but at your local independent bookseller is the absolute best place to get it. And as far as where to find me, I'm on TikTok and Instagram and YouTube. I'm Tad Stoermer everywhere. I'm fairly accessible, and we're going to be talking about this all the time and having conversations about it. And one of the things that I think is important to me is that you're the first person I've talked to since finishing the book, and that was important to me too. That as these ideas are finally coming together in coherence after this fairly in-depth process of engaging these questions, which, frankly, Kris, I spent months dealing with the question about violence and the question of that point of resistance and trying to deal with it honestly, because it's an important inflection point in what we're talking about. But in finally getting to this side of it and really being able to draw out what it really means, it was important for me to kind of be able to connect with you, to be able to start working out these ideas and their implications.
Tad, thank you so much. I really appreciate you giving all this time. All right, Tad, author of A Resistance History of the United States, available in June from Penguin Random House. Thank you so much for joining the program. It's really great to have you.
Such a pleasure, Kris. Thank you.
The far right knows how to manipulate American mythology. Our job is to break that spell and organize with the truth on our side. You don't need a PhD to fight fascism. You need courage, community, and conviction. That's what we're building right here together. If today's conversation helped sharpen your thinking, send it to someone who needs to hear it. For audio, subscribe to On Offense on Apple and Spotify. To watch the video version of this podcast, look for On Offense on Substack and subscribe to Valor Media Network on YouTube. Leave a review on every platform you can. That's a really helpful way to get this podcast to reach new audiences. I'm Kris Goldsmith. On Offense is produced by Gina Kim and Ember 20 as part of the Valor Media Network. Thanks for joining me. Now let's go on offense.